Outing, as well as my wonderful partners in the library, Jennifer Behrens and Shanna Bangerel, for their hard work to make this event possible. Today, we're here to celebrate Professor Shitong Qiao's newest book, The Authoritarian Commons, Neighborhood Democratization in Urban China. It is published by Cambridge University Press, and as a Duke Law faculty, student, or staff, you have access to this book in print and electronically through our law library subscription. Professor Qiao is the Kangyang Gang Yun and Gina Park Yun Distinguished Professor of Law at Duke Law School. He also holds the title of Honorary Professor at the University of Hong Kong, and he is a core faculty member of the Asian Pacific Studies Institute at Duke University. And today, we're also so privileged to have Professor Jed Purdy join us as a commentator and a moderator. Professor Purdy is the Raphael Lefkin Distinguished Professor of Law at Duke Law School. He's a prolific scholar who teaches and writes about environmental, property, and constitutional law, as well as legal and political theory. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Qiao and Professor Purdy.
Hi. So we've agreed that we're going to address each other by first name, and also that we're going to proceed in conversation. I'll be posing questions to Shitong, and he'll be riffing off them. We also want to bring the audience in before the final 3.5 minutes. So be thinking about questions as we go through. After a couple of back and forths between us, we'll probably check with you and see whether you have anything. Then we'll check again periodically. So I definitely know the metabolic rhythm of like come, eat, digest, then start to think in the final 7 minutes. Try to put a little bit of thinking earlier. So this is a really, really wonderful book. And I want to get right into the meat of it. So Shitong, you explore this puzzle that the Chinese government wants to control Chinese society, and it seems in many respects implacably hostile to independent sites of power and decision-making. Unions, civic organizations, unauthorized religious organizations, etc. And yet, you've discovered this autonomous, self-organizing, often democratic institution in the heart of China's great cities, working in a kind of complex relationship with a regime, often one of tension, and it's homeowners associations. Where do these come from, and what are they doing, and how do they matter in understanding where China is today?
Thank you so much, Jed, for the great question. Also, I want to thank Alex,
yes.
Thanks Shitong Qiao and the Dean's Office. Just to say I'm very grateful, and also for many colleagues and also students here, I'm very grateful for the nurturing and also supportive environment of Duke Law. So very, very, very grateful to be here. But yeah, getting back to the question, the homeowners associations. So where do they come from? What do they do, right? So okay, let me just share with you maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 examples, right, from my field of work. Why did people get involved in homeowners associations, right? One activist in Shenzhen told me why he got involved, because he moved into this apartment, he paid a lot of money for it, then the elevator just dropped from like the 20th floor to the 2nd floor, right? He was scared to death, right? He went to complain to the management company. The management company basically said, well, you're alive, right? The second activist, actually a gentleman who was an engineer before his retirement, he said his daughter actually got harassed in the neighborhood. Why? Because these Chinese neighborhoods are huge, actually very different from the neighborhood I live in right now in North Carolina, which has only 38 houses, right? These are like multiple towers, like 2,000 to 3,000 apartment units. So there are like a lot of common space, clubhouses, etc. Right? So homeowners are supposed to exercise like common property rights over such common space. but it's really the management company, right, which exercises control over such space. So why did this gentleman's daughter, actually teenage daughter, get harassed in the neighborhood? Because the management company actually controlled the space and rented the space to sex workers. So a supposed to be gated community had become a popular destination for people who are looking for commercial sex, right? So I think overall it's just how to say it's a sense of losing control over the space that they are living in, right? That have motivated them to basically to get associated, because that's by chance law, that's their legal right to do. And also by chance law, only the homeowners associations can actually replace a management company, right? Why didn't the management company respond to the first activist? Because he said, you are just one activist, right? You don't really represent all the interests of the homeowners, right? So that's basically what they do. I mean, there are many other issues. I remember the first time I presented this project, actually, that was my first time of presenting this project anywhere. So that was at Duke in 2019, also in the beautiful spring day. I think Professor Deborah Dimond basically said, oh, your book is about parking. Anyway, that's another issue. So I just talk about maybe last issue. Okay. So management fee. I mean, if you live in HOA here, you pay management fee. So in China, it's even more significant because Chinese homeowners, they don't really pay property tax. So there's no property tax on individual homeownership, but they do pay management fee, which I would say is kind of like a private tax, right? So the management companies can also increase management fee, right? But if you don't have your own association, basically you got to pay whatever they ask you to pay, right? They can intimidate you with security guards because these management companies, typically speaking, they have their own security guards, right? So not only intimidating you with lawyers, but also with security guards. So anyway, if you don't get associated and have your own representatives, which can control the management companies, you are at the mercy of the management company, which is a management company, but it's really what it has been doing is everything about that neighborhood. So that's their motivation to establish their own associations.
And what's the motivation for the law on the books and the law in practice to make room for them and even empower them? Because I see why people would want to take control of their own neighborhoods, especially against abusive management companies. But I would see that logic in unions and workplaces, for example, where it's not so available. So what's the reason for the legal system opening up this route to collective self-advocacy and self-organizing?
That's again, that's a perfect question, right? So China's real estate industry really got started in like late 1980s and fully launched in like a late 1990s, 1998, right? So we have lots of people in this classroom who really are interested in like individual rights, right? So the Chinese past actually shows, I would say, a very interesting development of the concept of rights. So at the very beginning, homeowner rights was framed by the homeowners themselves, by the society, even by the government as consumer rights. What does that mean? So the origin of China's real estate industry partially was the government needed money, right, like public finance, and they didn't have property tax. So they need to sell sell land, right, to make money, right, to finance the governmental operation, right? And to do that, what they did is like they sell land to developers, developers sell apartments to individual homeowners. So to make people buy these apartments, you need to give them like at least a minimum or basic sense of security, right? Whatever they buy is going to deserve the money. So that's like a very original motivation for the government actually to protect, also to grant the homeowners the rights, because they want to protect them as consumers. Therefore, they will continue to, or other Chinese citizens will continue to purchase such apartments. And the real estate industry, basically in the first 2 decades of the 20th century in China, was a pillar industry, right? So that was the incentive to, right? Because otherwise, with all the abusive companies, there had been like lots of complaints, and also conflicts, including violent conflicts in these urban neighborhoods. That would discourage people from buying apartments. And also, Chinese people, they also, petitioned and complained to the government. So the government, property management issue has become one of the top issue for urban conflicts in China in the past 2 decades. So they want for the government who cares about its legitimacy, it needs to find a way to address these issues. So one way to do it is basically to say let homeowners establish their own associations to supervise, to monitor these management companies. Therefore, in that way, the government basically gets the things done and without paying a penny, right? So that's the incentive for the government to legalize the association rights for homeowners.
So I want to see whether anyone wants to come in here. Okay. Yes, Jonathan Weiner.
Yeah, thanks, Shitong and Jen, really terrific. Just a question about the power of these homeowners associations. Like in the United States, they're often criticized for adopting rules that require conformity, or that everyone has to have the same house, or discriminating against who can live in the neighborhood. Does that happen in China, or what kinds of powers do the homeowners associations have?
Very well. So that's a great question. So I think the Chinese HOAs are still very far away from imposing constraints on homeowners' behaviors. I mean, they can do that, as I will explain in a minute. But at this stage, even after basically 2 decades of struggling with management companies, with the government, they are still at the stage of, most of them are trying to basically take control of their neighborhoods and also govern their own neighborhoods. So the most important issues for them now is, I would say, security, of their neighborhoods, because you don't want people to basically to come into your neighborhoods to steal stuff from you, right? That's the first one. The second one is just very relevant. It's about building maintenance. Building maintenance is safety, not only about the neighborhood, also about the building, the foundations. And to do that, there's a collective action problem. So each of the homeowners, they have paid tons of money, right? When they purchase an apartment to the building maintenance funding, okay? That's lots of money. But to use them, they need to make collective decisions through majority voting. So overall, I would say among all these issues, the top issue is to choose a management company that can serve their interest and also to monitor and supervise these management companies. So it's really about property management. So about the behavior regulations, there are a couple of issues, but I think it's still very far from the US context. So the issues I have come across is, for example, one issue for our students from China might be aware of is dogs in the neighborhood, which have actually beaten kids in some accidents as reported by the public media. Actually, some of the dogs have tragic accidents, have beaten kids to death. So some of the neighborhoods I have visited, they have tried to pass regulations at the neighborhood level to basically limit or to regulate how people should keep their dogs, right? So yeah, there are issues about behavior regulation, but they have not gone as far as to in the US context, so constraining homeowner behaviors, right? So I think it's just different stages of development. They might come to a stage of the US HOAs, but I don't know, that might be 20, 30, or 40 years later, but not there yet.
So are these a phenomenon of entirely new neighborhoods? That's the picture you gave for us. Greenfield 30 years ago, massive apartment buildings go up, and there's a new neighborhood. Is that the only setting in which these HOAs exist?
So these are not the only settings, right? So in urban China, you also have multiple categories. I mean, when I was doing field work about my first book, an official in the Beijing Bureau of Housing told me that officially they had 30 categories of housing. in a city, but I wouldn't bother you with that details. I would just say the commercial condominium housing, that's like the major form of housing for urban Chinese. So if you look at or check the Chinese Civil Code, which was passed in 2020, or Chinese property law, which was passed in 2007, this is like the only form of housing authorized by the property law in 2007 and also by Civil Code in 2020. So that's like where most Chinese live. Yeah, so that's the major one. But what you, I mean, in our previous conversations, right? Another form is like the employers, okay, in the urban area, like government agencies, state-owned enterprises, or public universities, right? They also provide housing to their employees. So in that kind of neighborhood, which is a minority in urban China, I think the social order in such neighborhoods, they simply replicate the corporate or the administrative order, right, of your employer. So that's housing. It's just less interesting. That has been going since 1949, since the founding of the People's Republic of China. But this type of homeowners associations, like entirely new, people move into such neighborhoods without prior connections, right? Their only common identity is homeowner. They have to treat each other as equals. They cannot follow each other's order because nobody is higher than another. So this is entirely new. So many activists have interviewed. Of course, they can be biased, but I'm persuaded they believe that this is, how to say, a revolution of living, basically a revolution of lifestyle in China. And also it's a foundation for the so-called new citizens without basically the constraints or prior conditions imposed either by history or by politics.
So this is totally fascinating. I just want to highlight the power of the portrayal you've just given. That this is a new institutional form of collective self-government, but it's arising within and makes sense within a new social world in which people are facing one another on a different set of terms than has been present anywhere in the widespread sort of lived experience of modern China. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Almost as if entering into this new neighborhood and real estate market makes you, puts you on the ground floor of liberal citizenship or something like that.
Yeah.
So that leads to something exactly that I wanted to ask. You said earlier that the homeowners associations exist in part because the state is concerned with legitimacy. And my mind goes back to conversations 15 years ago, seems almost impossibly distant now, when optimistic commentators in the West would frequently say that market-modeled changes in China implied a movement toward liberal and ultimately democratic legal and political ordering, because markets make middle classes, and middle classes want the rule of law, and they want democratic feedback. And I would say recently commentators have rushed to say that that was an entirely wrong estimation. One could take your story and say, no, the timeline was just wrong, or maybe you were looking in the wrong places, but that actually this is a kind of incipient life of liberal democratic norms and practices. I wonder how it looks from within, how that question looks from within the HOAs, and I wonder how it looks from within the state. My bet is that the state scandal is that the liberal commentators were not quite right, but rather that middle-class homeowners are invested in stability, and the state is also invested in stability. And you can kind of delegate self-government downward because what you ultimately want is to keep things in line, and so do homeowners. So what's the kind of big scale politics and political meaning of this phenomena?
This is just truly wonderful, right? I guess a short answer would be what we are looking at right now. This book is a bottle, like half full and half empty situation. Let me explain. Okay, the second point before I get into the details is like I do believe that the so-called modernization thesis, right? The idea that liberal free markets lead to demand for democracy, for freedom, for rule of law. After working on the project of this book, I do strongly feel that there is a point of this modernization thesis. Before I worked on this book, I thought this thesis is either boring, like who hasn't talked about this? Why would I work on such a cliche, right? Or ridiculous, because now like everybody thinks that's just totally wrong. But after, again, interviewing so many people and understanding how people, like homeowners, really mobilize and working on the system, I feel like there is a point, right? The point is like economic freedom actually has led to demand for liberty, demand for self-governance, and for democracy. So that's what I said. I think the most solid implication of this book is about how Chinese actually get to practice democracy on a daily and regular basis, even without talking like the big implications at the national level or the political issues like the big democratization. So that's, I guess, the second point I want to make. I want to get to the details. But before I forget, I think this is also an important message related to the modernization thesis. I know this is not exactly your question, but since this is a book about China, I think partly the American strategy of engaging with China in the past 4 decades was actually built upon this idea of modernization, right? China is going to become freer because of globalization and marketization. And right now, particularly in this moment, many Americans believe that, okay, that engagement has been a failure because China has become not more free, but more authoritarian, right? So economic development has led to a more authoritarian China. So I think my book is kind of, I would say, is different from this hypothesis or understanding of how China has become. So what my book has revealed, I would say, is like the society has definitely become more free. There's more widespread like a right consciousness and a right awareness. So in other words, what I'm thinking about myself, right? My friends in China, even for those people who work in the government, their idea, their understanding of social order and also political order has been fundamentally different from my parents and my grandparents, right? So I think that's something we cannot just forget, either if you are working on policy issues or on theoretical issues about modernization, about democracy. So with these statements, I'm coming back to my statement of the bottle half full and half empty. Let me get back to, related back to your question about why and how the Chinese government has legalized HOAs. It was not like a straightforward decision without controversy. Back then, it was the Ministry of Housing, which is in charge of this real estate market, proposed to legalize HOAs, but the Ministry of Civic Affairs, which was in charge of the grassroots level government of the party state, actually strongly opposed it. Basically, it said, okay, these HOAs, once established, are going to replace all the grassroots level party state organizations. We cannot allow that to happen. But the Ministry of Housing basically said, oh, you are the public organization, right? Those party state organizations, you are public organs. We, HOAs, we are just concerned about property management. So there's a public-private distinction. So don't worry about us. We'll stick to that distinction. So that's to say, going back to this half-full, half-empty thesis, is clearly there is a dilemma, right? There is an interest of having such HOAs to increase the legitimacy and the performance of the state, but also there is a concrete concern, not just a theoretical concern, for these HOAs could challenge the state's control over society, right? So I have more to say about the half thesis, but we have questions. I can.
Great. Great. I'm starting to collect people. I see Sarah Bloom-Raskin, Larry Helfer, Matt Adler, and Stuart Benjamin. Sarah.
Shitong, this is such a compelling vision that you're presenting here. And I think I want to ask about a particular market condition, which I have perceived in China, and I don't know the extent to which it's a driving force here, but would like your comment on it, which is that for years, there have been these huge vacant properties, right? So there has been an overbuilding phenomenon in China where there's been a lot of really a lot of real estate that needed to be occupied, right? To what extent, and I think it's a relevant question as we try to even imagine if something like this could be, maybe piloted or experimented here in the US, but to what extent was the sort of the huge amounts of vacancies a driving force for the enticement of people into these properties with the kind of, carrot of a sort of a local democratic set of norms?
That's a very insightful question, right? So there is I'll talk about why there have been so many vacant properties, right? Again, because the city governments in China, they needed to make money, right? They sell land, developers need to sell those apartments, right, to individual homeowners. So we can talk about agglomeration economics, the mismatch between space and the population, etc. But anyway, right, there's a huge amount of vacant properties demonstrates the urgent need, right, for the government and also for developers to sell to homeowners, right? And to do that, you not only have to provide with the concrete space, you need to give them right to make them their investment would be worthwhile. And one part of that right or the mechanism to make them feel like their investment would be worthwhile is actually the right to associate and also the right to govern their own neighborhoods. So I would say, yes, your example perfectly demonstrates that the government had an urgent need to support HOAs.
Larry Helfer.
So Shitong is super interesting story, and I have a question about how the boundaries around the competence of the HOA are maintained. Because if you have rights consciousness, including freedom of association, that doesn't necessarily respect the public-private divide, which is what you posited that the housing ministry said, look, don't worry, it's not going to affect the local party structure because this is just private, that's you have public, and we're not going to go there. But rights consciousness doesn't necessarily have that limit. So there must be, for this kind of situation to flourish, explicit or implicit boundaries beyond which if you try to say, well, because we do X in the HOA, we should be able to do something else at the village level or at the city level. But clearly that could be viewed as problematic. So have you seen situations where there have been attempts of the HOAs to push boundaries and then there's been a kind of pushback? How does that dynamic work?
Yes, definitely. I have one chapter entire chapter to address exactly the question you have raised, right? I call it associations beyond the property and the neighborhood, in the sense that such associational activities has gone beyond the physical boundaries of the neighborhoods, but also has gone beyond the virtual boundaries of property management as an issue. I'll give you a non-representative, but I would say more interesting example, just for fun. What's the connection between HOAs and the Beijing Bar Association? The Beijing Bar Association is the association of all the 40,000 lawyers in Beijing. The connection is a few activist lawyers, they had been very successful in organizing homeowners, okay, to basically establish their own associations to replace the management company. So they somehow realized that, they got a taste of success. They were successful, right, in helping these homeowners establishing their associations, and also they made money, right? So and they thought, oh, actually, this rights on paper, right? The property law, right, right to association can be really implemented in China. Right? So one issue in the neighborhood, as I have said earlier, is about the management fee. Then they thought, oh, there's a similar issue regarding the Beijing Bar Association. The Beijing Bar Association charge annual membership fee, just like the New York Bar or American Bar Association, right? From all these lawyers. I mean, some are rich, but some of them were not rich, right? These lawyers thought, okay, the annual fee charged by the Beijing Bar Association is too high. And by the way, the board of the Beijing Bar Association on paper should be elected, but it was not really elected. So the same group of activist lawyers basically thought, okay, if we can be successful at organizing and mobilizing the homeowners associations, maybe we should try with the Beijing Bar Association. So they tried and they succeeded partially. That goes back to the half-half thesis. So they succeeded. So the electoral, sorry, the election procedure of the Beijing Bar Association on paper goes with 2 steps. The first step, you elect like the lawyers, right? They also have like electoral districts. You elect your own representatives to the annual assembly of the Beijing Bar Association. Then your representatives at that assembly elect members on the board of the Beijing Bar Association. So these activist lawyers, right, actually were successful in the first step, but in the second step, the top political and legal, the political and legal committee of China, which was like the top political organ in charge of police, national security, actually they intervened. Basically, they said, okay, we cannot allow the democratization of Beijing Bar Association to happen. So this is one, of course, as I have said, not a necessarily representative, because democratization or mobilization in other areas of the society really depends on many other variables and factors, including how the state perceives the benefits and the risks of associations. But it has happened beyond the property, beyond the neighborhoods.
Matt Adler.
Let me get my colleagues and saying how fascinating this important work is. So my question dovetails with Larry's, which is, I would guess, of course we're going to go wrong, that even if in its core competence, which is sort of dealing with the private property, the party must be, at least to some extent, embedded in the HOA. If only because some occasional members and presumably officials are party members. Now, it seems to me from a political economy perspective, there's an interesting trade-off. That is, the party would want its control to be somewhere between 0% and 100%. If it's 100% control, then this thing is no legitimating function. It's transparently just a party organ. If it's 0%, well, it might get out of control. So is that right? And how does the party sort of navigate through the trade-off?
That's definitely right. You're always right. And this is, yeah. I also have dealt with this question in my book. So you're right. For the party, since 2017, right, it has formulated a national strategy. The strategy in one sentence for the party is to have the cake and eat it too, right? So, and they took exactly the strategy you have mentioned, right? They have required basically a certain percentage of the members of the board of HOAs to be party members, right? So that's their strategy. Basically to say we want the HOAs, I mean, the percentage was like from like 40 to 60% of the members of the board of HOAs needed to be party members. So this is come from the very top, the national level, right? But again, going back to Jed's point about law in action and law on the paper, or policy on paper and policy in action. But in reality, from big cities to smaller cities, this policy has not been successful and has been implicitly or explicitly resisted by the homeowners. Why? It's not because that these homeowners are, I want to make it very clear. I talked to many of them. They're lovely people, but most of them, I mean, they are a small minority, but most of them are not interested in challenging the party's leadership at a national level. Actually, if you ask them, they will say they fully embrace the leadership of the party, right? But that being said, right, what has made them resist, sometimes publicly and through legal channels, the party's requirement of have party leadership in the HOAs? Pragmatic concerns. Because they basically told me that, oh, we don't have 40 to 60% party members in the neighborhood. If you impose this requirement on us, the HOAs are just going to become malfunctioning, where we won't be able to have a HOA. Therefore, we won't be able to effectively manage our neighborhood. That's just impossible. right? And they told that directly to whoever the party officials want to implement the policy. And also they challenged it on the basis that, oh, the civil code, the property law never says anything about the party's membership, right? Party leadership in the HOAs. So sorry, we just cannot do this for pragmatic reasons. We would love to do it. We just can't. Yeah.
Stuart Benjamin.
So this question builds on some of your earlier work and conversations we had. So I'm fascinated by the story that there was some happenstance in how this HOAs got created because of the interests of various local governments and various different government agencies that had their own agendas here. And I'm just thinking about whether or not this was anyone's intention at the level of Xi Jinping or somewhere else, where you might nonetheless think, look, this is great as long as it's a pressure valve. As long as all we're doing is just letting people have the sense of having a little bit of control, that's fine. We're just going to make sure that it doesn't ever get beyond that. Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm just wondering how you think about two related questions, which is one, is that how these HOAs are seen by the people around Xi Jinping, mm-hmm. et cetera. Mm-hmm. But two, however they see it, how you think about the degree to which they really do present a challenge, and frankly, the limits on the challenge they're going to be able to. We know all the various Chinese proverbs about the nail that sticks out. It's at some point being knocked out. So I'm wondering how you think they think about it, and how you think about how far they can go.
Yeah, sure. So President Xi is a person who strongly believes in party leadership, right? He has this very famous saying that the party should lead everything, right? That goes back to my conversation with Matt about requiring parties' leadership or membership on the board of HOAs. But another person a leader of China I want to point to actually has a much closer connection with HOAs, who is the current vice chairman of China, used to be the member of the standing committee of political bureau. So Han Zheng, who was #1 or party secretary in Shanghai, and he created actually what I term as the Shanghai model. So Han Zheng, since like late 1990s and early 2000s in Shanghai, he basically figured that we needed homeowners and homeowner associations to effectively govern our neighborhoods in Shanghai. So he made the establishment of HOAs actually the top priority during his administration in Shanghai. And he called it co-governance, basically the co-governance between HOAs and the party states grassroots level organizations, and basically formulating various policies to, on one hand, facilitating the development of HOAs, but also finding other ways to control such HOAs. So I think this experience, right, in Shanghai, because now he's in the leadership, right, of China, must have been kind of reflected, right, in the more recent policy changes in China since 2017, right? So I would say overall, right, I think the Chinese approach, right, to HOAs is basically what we talked about earlier, the authoritarian dilemma. They see the benefits, they see the risks, they want to have it, and also they want to control it. But from time to time, when they say like the HOAs are really, going beyond control, they institute like lots of constraints and requirements, such as like party requirements, such as also like the recent civil code in 2020, right, also changed the rules of voting by the HOAs. Because just like American elections, right, if you increase the threshold of passing the resolution, that would make the function of HOAs much, much more difficult. So there are many ways for the party state to control it. But at the end of the day, like in my opinion, I think because of this very pragmatic concerns, it's just very difficult for the party state to totally eliminate HOAs or even to effectively control such HOAs. Exactly because what Matt Adler has said earlier, right? If you are going to effectively control them, right, then firstly, whether you have resources to do that. If the party state had the resources to directly administer such neighborhoods, there would have not been a need for such HOAs, right? So my opinion would be this is going to be, a sustainable democratic practice in China's urban Chinese neighborhoods, which, even against the ups and downs of Chinese politics. So many things about China we have been talking about, right, in early 2000s have gone. But this thing from early 2000 until today is actually very sustainable. But I still want to add one qualification. That goes back to Larry's point about to what degree, right? To what extent can such democratization effect get spillover to other areas? I think that very much depends. And in the very constraining political environment like today, I would say these homeowner activists actually are very cautious. They are acting exactly like the officials of Ministry of Housing when they proposed that to legalize HOAs. They basically said, yeah, we are property. They used to call themselves homeowner activists. Now they call themselves property management experts. Right? So in one word, I think the democratization of neighborhoods, of property management is still very much ongoing. People still have the chance to practice democracy, which I think is inherently valuable. But we shouldn't, I wouldn't exaggerate like the spillover effect, because there's so many variables at play. That's why I believe, again, it's the practice of democracy rather than the big D. I know everybody is very interested in that. That's really most valuable here.
I don't know whether others have had this experience, but I find this year that when I am writing about property in our Microsoft Outlook program, it autofills as property management. So maybe our email system is also making anticipatory adjustments for our perilous times. Dylan Eck.
Yeah, I know when Evergrande indicated that many of the people that have been paying mortgages on apartments for years wouldn't be getting their apartments. There were actually anti-government protests in response to that, which is very rare in China. Do you think things like that, in addition to the creation of these HOAs, beyond just a trend towards local democracy, do you think it indicates a trend towards people in China expecting to have more control over their private property and a changing view of what private property rights mean in China?
Great question, and also there are, I think, at least two responses, right? The first one, I have to get back to this private-public distinction. I do believe, and also this Evergrande, right? That's the opposite of empty apartments. It's like people have paid hundreds of thousands of dollars, but their apartments are yet to be built, right? And then there have been lots of protests ongoing in China, even today, right? Because, several million apartments are waiting to be built, and I'm not sure they are going to be built, right? The point here is like, whatever the ideals, you need to mobilize people, and how you can mobilize people, private incentives. For example, private property rights, right? Most Chinese, I would say, at least from appearance, are apolitical, right? In the sense that we don't want to get too political, to quote unquote make trouble. So the HOAs and also the protests of these Evergrande home buyers, right, are rather chances where you say these people actually get associated, get organized, and get mobilized, and to publicly protest, right, to challenge the party state. Because of a very boring reason, because they are concerned about, their investment, right? In the case of, Evergrande home buyers, or because of their concern about the preservation of their property value in the case of HOAs. I forgot to mention earlier that another incentive or motivation for the homeowners to establish their own associations was because that, like some of them told me that, you see, these two neighborhoods right across the street, they were built almost at the same time by the same developer, but one had its own associations, the other didn't. And then you see a significant difference in the price of the property, right? So they, just for the preservation of property value, they had to, or they wanted to protest. I think that's a commonality I see between homeowners who have already lived in their homes and homeowners who have not, gotten their apartments delivered, right? So yeah.
There was a pretty dramatic moment in Chinese COVID policy when the government reversed its draconian measures quickly. And from the outside, it could seem as if there had been a kind of withdrawal of social consent to the measures, or at least a lot of resistance to them at about the same time. How did you read that set of events? And did the homeowners associations play a role as the forum for community counter-mobilization against what the state was doing?
Oh, great question. I have a chapter addressing exactly the COVID lockdown and what HOAs have played, like what roles they have played. And also this is, I think, perfectly related to earlier questions about the modernization thesis, right? Because again, the general impression about the COVID lockdowns is that they have demonstrated the strength, right, of the Chinese government, right? How it has been able to mobilize, resources and people and lock down hundreds of thousands of neighborhoods and millions of people, right? So fast, right? Compared to probably a little bit more chaotic responses by democratic states, right? But the field work I did in 2023, basically in Shanghai, in Beijing, and Wuhan, interviewing these urban residents about their experiences during lockdowns, was revealing a quite different lesson or reality, right? So, okay, a little bit details here, right? When you lock down a neighborhood, you don't just do lockdowns, right? First, you need to think about how to lock down. Do you send the police to lock down, or just tell people they need to stay at home, right? So the answer to that, even in China, what I found really amazing, right, is like they didn't send the police, right? They don't really say, you didn't really say police at the gates of these neighborhoods. So who did the lockdown, right? And secondly, when you lock down people in their neighborhood, who is going to provide food to these people? Even, right, for any government, you don't want your people to starve to death, right? So that's about the delivery of public service and also like a medical service, right? So it's a very, complicated project for such lockdowns, right? So who did all this kind of work? Again, goes back to our half thesis, the homeowners associations in most of the cases. Because of what? Because of the government didn't have the resources, financial or personnel resources, to really directly administer or lock down such neighborhoods. It's the formal or informal associations of the homeowners who actually had organized, for example, their own volunteers to tell people that, oh, you should not really go out, right? Of course, today we had a very negative view of the lockdowns. But in the earlier stage, some neighborhoods actually decided, like in Wuhan, they had decided to lock down their neighborhoods even before the citywide announcement of lockdowns, because they believed that the virus was dangerous, right? And also about the food, they also basically organized the volunteers to purchase food from everywhere in the city and deliver to their neighbors, like several thousand neighbors. So for me, it's really, the whole COVID experience tells me how much the party state actually had relied upon these HOAs to do its job. And HOAs were willing to do it partly because they, at least in the earlier stage, like the first half of the stage of the COVID pandemic, they believe it served their own interest. They were scared about the virus, right? And also even in this process, they also, resist the government's what they call unreasonable policies, also try to defend their own self-governance. For example, like in one neighborhood in Wuhan, right, the HOA chairman basically told me that we were happy when the government said maybe you guys need to lock down, to quarantine, whatever. He said we were happy with that, but when the government said they wanted to send some, outsourced security company employees to guard the gate of our neighborhood, we simply said no, right? It's kind of like a homeowner or sovereignty going on here. But coming to the second stage, right, in the latter stage of COVID lockdowns, when people basically, had enough, right, of the lockdowns, and also because of kind of the freedom of information. The most important one, anybody like soccer here? I'm not a big soccer fan, but I was told during my fieldwork in I think it's 2022, which year was the FIFA or whatever, the World Cup, right? These Chinese homeowners, like urban residents, basically, we watch the TV, like a FIFA, right, or the World Cup. Hundreds of thousands of people in the stadium, they were not scared about such a virus. Why should we be scared about? Anyway, there's an update of their information or belief, so they decided to resist, right? Firstly, in their neighborhoods, and once we saw the newspaper reports, right, about the white paper movement, street protest, but that's the tip of the iceberg. What's really underwater is really hundreds of thousands of protests within neighborhoods. I think that's the foundation. Actually, the most widely, the so-called white paper movement in Shanghai was next to actually an affluent neighborhood in Shanghai. That neighborhood was the first one in Shanghai, which declared that it's going to unlock itself, like we call lockdown, right? You said, okay, we're going to unlock ourselves against the government's order. So there is a direct connection going on there. The takeaway, at least from my appearance, is like when the homeowners cooperate, the whole system can work. And when there's a widespread resistance, right? I was surprised. The government basically said, okay, I'm going to back down and change policies. I was totally surprised.
Seems like a fascinating instance of the theme that Matt raises. The state capacity increases with the existence of the homeowners associations, but the state scope of action also gets constrained by the same measure. So I want to talk a little about just how you came to make this book, because we've gotten so deep into the meat of it so quickly. When did you know you were really onto something? When did you know just how interesting this was going to be? What was that experience like?
Thank you. I like theory, but also I like intuition, like when I do research, right? So that's about 2017. I finished my first book. I was thinking about what to do next. So what I found back then interesting was I'm from China. I graduated from multiple universities there, in the online WeChat or online social media groups, right? And also personal social media, or multiple classmates of mine, basically, back to Peking University Law School, right? These are a typical legal professionals, middle class or even upper middle class. They were talking about homeowners associations. Back then, I thought it was a very boring issue, right? Why were you guys so idle, so much obsessed with homeowners associations, right? Our class was 110 students in total, 110 people. Now they are, working everywhere, in the government, outside the government, They were talking about this, they were debating about this in the, class group, and they were talking about also how they fought the government, right? Complaining to the government, negotiating with the government, and even organizing protests, right, against the government. I was like, this is not what you guys were supposed to do, right? Right? You were the backbone of the regime, right? You were graduating from Peking University Law School. You were, this is not what you're going to. And also, you make, these people they make, by Chinese standard, lots of money per month. And when you get involved in the HOAs in the neighborhood, it's a non-paid job. And you devoted 10, 20, 30 hours per week to do that. Chinese, I think myself, I'm so obsessed with my career, right? We are not particularly public spirited. But when I saw this, I said, this is something different, right? What's going on? So that's the beginning. Then I had, actually, because it's all the classmates, right? I just had a conversation with them. They said, oh, you need to do this research, right? We were really interested in this. And, so that's how I got started. Yeah.
What do you think this, oh, Carrie? No.
Probably going to ask the same thing.
Probably not. I bet money. This is a property theory question.
Shitong, I was going to ask, following up on Jed's last question, were there moments writing the book when you thought, I don't know if I'm going to be able to find out what I need to find out, or just moments where you doubted the project? Like I would imagine you're 2 books beyond me in terms of books published at this point, but there must be moments with a huge project like this where there's bumps in the road, and I wondered if you could say more about that.
I think there were, but I would say the second book in general is actually has been an easier one than the first one, because the first one was about like an informal housing market. I mean, it's public, but it's informal, therefore it's very difficult to get to the key players in that informal housing market. The easier part of this second book project is homeowners. They're everywhere, right? They are my classmates, my friends in China, urban residents. So you can basically initiate a conversation with anybody in China about their property, about their home ownership, about such associations. So in that sense, it is easier, but I do want to confess that in the process, my understanding or how I feel about this project also gets changed a bit. I came in, right, with inspiration from my classmates, right, and also some of them I got contacted, like in the early stage, also talk about political ideals, right, it's a revolution of lifestyle, it's the hope for new citizenship in China. I got really my hopes up, right, in the first stage. But when I really get deeper into this project, I'm sure for people who study social movement, you probably have a similar feeling. Like when you get to the details, any social movement or any business is going to be, boring, it's going to be complicated, and the heroes you thought were not really heroes, right? They are just human beings, they have their weakness, some are even bad people, full of egos, right? So I think I did have a question in the middle of the project thinking about, should I really think about this as a kind of democratization or social movement? Because clearly I cannot take as a very, it's not all just heroic or rosy, right? It's very complicated, lots of interests got tangled in this process. But at the end of the day, I thought, that's how democracy is, right? It's not only about ideals. It's about basically the bargaining of all sorts of interests, right? Good people, bad people, but the most important thing is like, this is not a process that's monopolized, right, by one decision maker, right? You got basically, even factions, right? Oh, that's what really got me, I don't know, disappointed, but really I thought this is just democracy, right? It's like lots of factions even in the neighborhoods, right? When you talk to one person, this person would badmouth about another person, and vice versa, right? But then I thought, yeah, it's natural to have factions, right? Even in neighborhoods, just like in any democracy. That's my confession.
One quick final question. Do you teach your property course differently in any way on account of what you've learned in this project?
I did pay more attention to the National case, the California cat case, right? It goes back to Jonathan's question about, basically our understanding of HOAs in the US is like they have imposed like lots of, unreasonable constraints, right? And limits on individual liberty and freedom. So I did pay more attention to that. And by the way, I also talked about that case actually in China, in Shanghai, in 2023, when I was doing fieldwork about COVID lockdowns. We organized a symposium with actually lots of professors from Shanghai to join. I thought, I want to talk about COVID, but I cannot. So why don't we talk about how HOAs in US and China regulate, cats and dogs? And that was very well attended. And afterwards, I was able to actually talk to them like informally about how they have behaved during COVID lockdowns.
That's the cat case is always a winner with students because it is charming and funny. But respectfully, I think you slightly undersell the book. I think the book's portrayal of property relations as a crucible of a kind of liberalization and even democratization that's not happening through other pathways kind of resituates property right at the center of questions about how institutional change happens where it might belong. So I think that the theoretical interest of the project outside of the corner of property law should be tremendous. And I hope it continues to get that kind of attention because it really deserves it.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Shitong, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.